On their way to bomb Japan, the B-29 crews couldn't see the island. It was far below them, often hidden by clouds. But they could detect the early warning radar down there. It would be sending the message back to Japan. The American bombers are coming. The B-29s were on their way from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. The island below was just a speck in the ocean, 650 miles south of Tokyo. But some unfortunate crews got a closer look. Returning with smoking engines, wings full of holes, wounded crewmen, low on fuel, they were now at low altitude, throwing out anything that could be unbolted to lighten their planes. They were hoping to make it home and not crash in the waiting ocean. Now they saw below them an ugly volcanic island. No paradise with palm trees here. The small island looked gray and brown and black, only 4 miles long, narrowing to the south end where the tall cinder cone of an extinct volcano jutted upwards. Looking at their maps, the navigators could see they were crossing over the island of Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island. They were still over 700 miles from home. They wished they could land, have a chance to refuel, repair their planes, and get the wounded much-needed medical attention. But Iwo Jima was a Japanese stronghold, so instead, the gunners watched apprehensively for Japanese fighter planes said to be based there. Iwo Jima had become a thorn in the side of the United States bombing campaign against Japan. A decision was made. The Marine Corps would invade.
The importance certainly of Iwo was that it was one of the spots of their inner defense line. There wasn't anything there. It was 670 miles from there to Tokyo and 700 miles approximately from the Marianas were our B-29s. And of course, the reason they wanted it was so that they could put some P-51 long-range fighters on the island so that he could accompany. Because prior to that, the 29s had to go without fighter support and had to have heavy fuel and fewer bombs.
The appearance of American fighters would mean protection for the B-29s, and with the airstrips on Iwo in American hands, those B-29s who did get shot up would have a safe place to land. If the bombing campaign was to kick into high gear, it only made sense to take Iwo Jima. But Iwo Jima came at a steep price. It would be the only battle fought by the U.S. Marine Corps in which they suffered more casualties than the enemy. A third of all Marines who died in combat in the war would fall on this small island. In terms of intensity, relentless combat, the percentage of the landing force that became casualties, and the number of lives that was paid per yard of ground, there was nothing to compare to the horror on that small island.
I landed in the same boat with our captain, but he only lasted for a half hour before he got hit. We changed company commanders 3 times in 2 days.
There were 68 of us when we hit the island, and when we left the island 28 days later, out of the, not all of them were killed, some of them were injured and brought off, but out of the original group, I was one of 3 that never lasted all 28 days.
Grantham got hit, killed. Alonzo Green died of wounds. My buddy Holcomb got killed. Cordy got killed. He was a Golden Gloves champion from upstate New York. Paul Rotundo got hit, not badly, he got hit in the arm. His buddy, Frank Stellato, got hit twice. Second time was when the stretcher bearers, they came under fire, the stretcher bearers dropped him, took off, and he got hit again on the stretcher. And so many guys gone.
There was just constantly trucks coming from the front with Marines dead, and they were being dumped into this pit. Now, they did take one dog tag off, and the other remained on the corpse. Well, Here they are. They've turned black because they had rotted up there, and the body fluids are oozing out of them, and sometimes you see gorgeous blonde hair on this black face of some 18-year-old kid, and millions of flies, billions of flies.
252 men. We lost about 100 of us survived the first day. And on the 7th day, we got 50 replacements. On the 24th day, there was only 12 of us left out of that 300.
That was 34 days of constant fighting, almost 24 hours a day. If there was a hell, we went through it on Iwo Jima. We had 5,892 dead, over 17,000 wounded. The Japanese had approximately 25,000 on the island, and at the end of 33 days, or 34 days, we only took 337 prisoners. I have never in my life been through anything like that.
This is the story of Iwo Jima, the courage, the sacrifices, and the savagery of Sulphur Island. While New Guinea, with its dense jungles, steep mountains, and disease-ridden swamps, and the storm-whipped Aleutians, with its treacherous wind and cold weather, were places no one in their right mind would want to fight a war, Iwo Jima had them both beat. Its hot volcanic surface, with its sulfur fumes, its twisted and folded ground, its volcanic ash beaches, and its almost total lack of vegetation was like nothing the Marines had encountered before or since.
It looked like a little thing about 8 miles long, and I don't think it was even 8 miles long. It had 8 square miles in the whole thing. Big volcanic thing on one end and a big flat thing on the other.
At that time, I never saw a tree on Iwo Jima. It was just a bare, rocky, sandy. I thought they were sulfur pots, or what, sulfur-smelling island anyway.
And then, of course, the beach, it was wet and sticky and all up your clothes and your weapons in your hands, and it was the black sands of Iwo Jima.
Iwo was a volcanic island, you know. And it was so hot that you could dig down only about a foot. Once you got down a foot, it was so hot you couldn't stand it. So you could dig a foxhole only about a foot. Fortunately, there were other holes there that the Japanese had made, and there were shell holes we could use for foxholes, and dig a foxhole in the bottom of that, you know. So we were enough underground, it was be safe. The good part of it was if you wanted to cook anything, like a sea ration, you know, all you had to do was punch a hole in the can so it wouldn't explode, and put it in this hot soil and it would cook.
It was a dull, grayish, brownish place all over, with this black sand and rock full of sulfur. Rock was very light. You could pick it up, a boulder very, very easily. And the blood would soak into it very easily. I remember Sweeney's blood soaking into it. Yeah, as he stood up yelling. And the tangle of boulders and draws, little valleys, just a nasty, nasty place.
To think he respects them as a body. And by the way, when he first goes to Iwo in late 1944, it's a backwater, meaning he's got a bunch of old, overage, not healthy, or too young reservists. Well, he's not going to do the bonsai business. He's going to make you come to them.
Thank God that the Japs only had him. The Japanese general on that island, he was one of the smartest generals that the Japanese Army had during World War II. He had pre-registered every gun on that island. And he could call any gun and say, hit target 17. And they could hit it.
Kurabayashi said, no, we are not going to fight on the beach. We are going to allow the Americans to land. We will cede them the beach, and we will make them fight for every inch of the way northward and southward to Suribachi. And there will be no so-called banzai attacks at all. So he fought his people very well. The basic idea was something like this. And at Okinawa, we will extract as many casualties as possible on the Americans. We will lose. We will be defeated. But if we extract so many casualties, they will not attempt maybe a landing on Japan itself. Maybe they will negotiate, ask for terms, and maybe we can get out of the war that way. The terrain was ideal for the defense.
Fortunately for Kurabayashi, the Japanese had been mining Iwo Jima for sulfur for some time. His engineers expanded the mines until there were miles of tunnels under the island. Over 1,500 pillboxes were built, along with observation posts and headquarters. From their caves, tunnels, and pillboxes, his infantry would get a lot of good shots with their rifles and machine guns. But the main killing was to be done by the hundreds of artillery pieces hidden away in caves and pillboxes, and the thousands of mines he had scattered all over the island.
When it came time to take Iwo Jima in mid-February 45, it was built up. Major reinforcements had been there, not tested troops, but a lot of them with good weapons and sophisticated bunkers and caves and hideouts and so forth. Good fields of fire. Beaches that were volcanic ash and sand without good footing, hard to move in, hard to run in. Had a lot of stuff going for them. Obvious landing beaches, because there were mountains on one side. I mean, there were places that Marines had to land. And it was very easy to sight guns, hidden guns in caves and bunkers and so forth, high up, overlooking the beach. The Japanese totally dominated the beaches.
Iwo Jima was unique. It was a mass of tunnels. Mount Suribachi was almost hollow, with tunnels that go out to these different pillboxes. And the Japs could go from one pillbox to the next pillbox without ever coming topside.
There were 16 miles of tunnels under that island. It was an old sulfur mine. And there were 16 miles of tunnels. And that's where the Japs were. They were in it, not on it. It didn't make any difference how much you shelled or bombed. You couldn't get to them.
You rarely saw one. You might see one running occasionally, but very seldom do you ever see one. Yet they were coming out of caves. They were firing from pillboxes and emplacements. They had mortars rounds zeroed in all over the island. It was just one constant maze of pillboxes. But and it was just, one by one, you had to do them. You couldn't, if you bypassed them, somebody else had to take care of them because there were live Japs inside.
You would be absolutely amazed the size of holes that those people could crawl through where they tunneled. Much of it is a soft sandstone. Was ideal for their purpose because it's fairly easy to dig. Once it's exposed to air, it hardens. Not like granite, but it hardens sufficiently that it's, for their purposes, is structurally sound. They would crawl through holes that you and I would have a hard time getting our ankles and feet into.
The Japanese had been trained on that island not to give up their life easily, and they didn't. Iwo Jima was one battle where the Marines had more casualties than the enemy. They stayed in a hole and they'd shoot and disappear, and they'd stay in a hole and pop up and shoot and disappear. There's no big charges, no big killings. It was just one Jap, one pillbox, one shell crater at a time.
While the Japanese defenses inflicted massive casualties on the Marines, for a moment, consider the situation of the Japanese defenders. Under bombing attack for almost 6 months, then pounded by naval shelling and dive bombers, they knew there was no escape. Living underground in soil hot enough to cook rations in, short on water, and faced by a remorseless attack by their most feared opponents, the United States Marines. They nonetheless held out until nearly all of them were killed, selling their lives in the belief that it might save their families the horror of a foreign invasion. They did their duty, albeit at the orders of a desperate and immoral government, to the very end. Including sailors and airmen, America would invade Iwo Jima with almost 72,000 men, including 3 divisions of the U.S. Marine Corps and some other supporting units. The Japanese defenders were outnumbered by the Marines, approximately 50,000 to 22,000. But this doesn't begin to speak to the American supremacy. Complete naval and air superiority by U.S. forces meant that not only would Kurabayashi's defenders receive no reinforcements or supplies, and that reinforcements, replacements, and supplies would flow freely to the Marines ashore, but also that half a dozen U.S. Navy battleships and hundreds of other naval vessels would provide gunfire support for the Marines. And over the island, American fighter bombers and light bombers would operate freely, pounding the defenders with tons of bombs and napalm. The Japanese defenders, on the other hand, would have to fight with the soldiers, ammunition, medical supplies, and water that they began the battle with. When it was all gone, the battle would be over. American intelligence based on decoded Japanese radio messages, aerial photographs, and observations from submarines gave them a clear indication that the island was being fortified. But the size of the Japanese garrison and the extent of its underground defenses and tunnel networks remained a mystery. And as it turned out, the Japanese strength on the island was underestimated by nearly 70%. While the Marine and naval planners might not have known exactly what they were up against, they didn't plan to take any chances. The bombers came first. B-17s and B-24s appeared over Iwo Jima for the first time in August and September of 1944, beginning a sporadic pounding that would continue for nearly 6 months. The first strikes by carrier aircraft began in December to add to the increasing tonnage of bombs cascading onto the small island from Army Air Corps bombers. But the aerial bombing could only do so much. The dirty job of securing Iwo Jima belonged to the Marines.
We went aboard ship in January. So we had about almost 30 days at sea, getting all the flotilla and all the ships together, the task force and all that.
We were a total, I think, 42 days aboard ship from the time we actually left Hawaii. We had calisthenics every morning, and that'd usually be at least an hour. And without that, we'd never been able to get off the damn ship after 42 days.
Many we just sat around waiting for Iwo, waiting for the chance to go to Iwo. We didn't know it was Iwo. We were told it was an island in the Pacific, but everybody speculated, and most of us realized it was going to be most likely Iwo from the description of things.
We shoved off, and in an enormous convoy. And after a day or two, they broke out maps and they broke out these rubber three-dimensional models of where we were going. And as we figured, it was Iwo Jima.
We spent a lot of time going over what was going to take place, what we were supposed to be doing, when we'd land, where we'd go, how to stay in contact. how to keep your head down. But just, they had mock-ups of the island, and each group, platoon would go in a number of times and go over it. Became quite familiar with what was going to take place. But, no one could begin to imagine what was going to take place at that point.
We had a lot of briefing. The main outfit on the ship, I was on the APA 106, the Hansford, and we had the 1st Battalion, 27 Marines there, the whole battalion just about. They made the landing on Red 2 when we were on the same beach, and they had a tremendous amount of intelligence material to share. We would get all kinds of aerial photographs repeatedly. They'd overfly the island every day and keep track of all the new fortifications. We had everything pinpointed. We used to study those photographs and see exactly where all the emplacements were. And of course, those guys had to land and take them.
The initial report was probably about a 5 to 10 day operation. I don't think anyone had any idea at that point exactly what was on there, and you really couldn't find out until you got there. But they had pretty good estimates that the beaches would be pretty well covered, and there'd be they had aerial photographs apparently, and had a pretty good idea of where the visible emplacements were.
And they didn't tell us much. They said, the 4th Division is going to be here, the 5th Division is going to cut across the island and take this big hill called Mount Suribachi. Then everybody's going to swing right, and it's going to take maybe 2 or 3 days, maybe a little bit more. That's what they told us. So on the other hand, I heard another bunch of people being briefed, and this NCO was saying they got so many 120 millimeter mortars here, they got so many pillboxes here, somebody is going to get hurt.
Then they gave us a briefing, and we saw this relief map of this little tiny island. We said, oh my gosh, we can take that in a week, no problem. So this lieutenant says, well, he says, you guys got a piece of cake. He said, within about 5 to 7 days, he said, we should be home. Yes, sir. We took his word for it. He lied.
They briefed us on the island because I remember talking to my buddies. I said, this island's that small. What do you think, maybe 4 or 5 days? And they said, about 3 or 4 days, Tom, we should have this island secured, because it's so small. Boy, were we wrong.
The plan for the seizure of Iwo Jima was very straightforward. The 4th and 5th Marines would go ashore side by side on the east side of the island. It was expected that by avoiding the better beaches on the west side of Iwo Jima, they would catch the Japanese defenders on the wrong foot. The 5th Division would strike straight across the island, cutting off Mount Suribachi the first day and then turning south to capture it, while the 4th Division secured the airfields and advanced north. As soon as Suribachi was taken, the 5th would turn 180 degrees and drive north up the west side of the island, while the 4th Division advanced with it on the east until they reached the end of the island, 4 miles away to the north. Expecting the operation to take from 3 to 10 A force of 6 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, and 1 light cruiser, supplemented by the lighter guns of destroyers and innumerable smaller craft, pounded Iwo Jima for 3 days and nights. Nearly 10,000 16, 14, 12, 8, and 6-inch shells slammed into the island, throwing up fountains of volcanic ash and cinders. The Marines just out of boot camp couldn't imagine that anything could live under such fire, but the older Leathernecks had seen massive bombardments before. They knew from experience that while the naval bombardments looked impressively devastating, in reality, they had little effect. Now they were wondering, hoping, will it be different this time?
We could look off from the distance there and see the island, see Suribachi sticking up there and all this bombing going on, all that dust and everything. And thought, oh boy, they're blowing the hell out of the enemy.
We got there, they were just shelling the hell out of it with about 4 or 5 battleships. And they'd done that. We sit off the beach there for one night, and they'd done it all night long and bombed it. They had aircraft carriers in there and everything.
They say there was somewhere close to 700 different craft out in that water, and I believe them. I think you could have stepped from one to another and never gotten wet. I'd never seen so many. And here's these great big battleships. Lord knows where they were. They were way out. But they were running those 16-inch cannons of theirs and just boom, boom, boom. It took me a while to understand what a 16-inch shell hurtling through the air sounds like. Sounds like a freight train.
We could hear a tremendous amount of noise, you know, the shelling by the battleships. And later the planes came over dive bombing and all. We got close. I'll just never forget the first sight of Iwo, you know, just this ugly-looking island with this volcano at the top and all this smoke over it, and the light of the shells exploding, you know.
You could hear this boom, boom, and you could see planes taking off and landing on the carriers, and you could see and hear this tremendous boom from the battleships and the cruisers. You sort of didn't hear it, you felt it in your belly.
I didn't mention the planes. They were overhead quite a bit too, especially just before the landing. They were strafing and bombing the island very heavily. It was really quite a sight to behold just before the landing. But once we got ashore, I was less conscious of all that.
But I think that was probably some of the worst missions that we had. You'd have to wait out in the water in the rendezvous area until the big guns from the battleships fired to kind of soften it up, and then the cruisers would fire and soften it up, and then we would go in. And in the meantime, these Marines were out there in the bay in their big landing craft to get into the little ones, and so they'd go aboard those rocky shores. It was a bad deal.
We didn't arrive until the 19th, which was D-Day, and our assignment, however, was Mount Suribachi. We were to fire at any gun emplacements we might see, and also to just lay down fire, blanket fire on the thing.
They were still firing virtually point blank, and they finally blew all of the foundation from around one of their reinforced concrete bunkers that was high up on the precipitous slope of the mountain, and it just came rolling down the mountain into the sea.
We had probably 600 Navy ships blasting Iwo Jima. The Air Force had been bombarding it for 120 consecutive days. When we got there, you could just see, well, it couldn't hardly see the beach because it was all dust and blown up, and our big naval gunfires right down onto the beach. How could a person survive on that island?
At 0630, the order went out. Land the landing force. The bombardment slowly lifted, and the LCVPs and Amtraks began to churn their way in towards the steep, dark beaches of Iwo Jima.
We formed our line with the landing craft and went around one of the battleships, and just shortly after we got around and got regrouped, they let go of the old 16-inchers. God, we thought we were sunk right then. I'm telling you, that blast from those things was unbelievable. And we still weren't thinking too much about it. And then we saw some of the landing craft coming back, and in couple of cases where the Navy machine gunners were manning the machine guns on them had been shot and were hanging over the side of the canopy around them. That kind of woke us up.
But we got aboard that craft and we went in and we hit the beach, and I forget what it was. Either the second or third wave, but it was real early on. And I had a base plate for the 81 millimeter mortar, weighed 85 pounds, and that was my baby. The first thing that crosses your mind is, just let us get on the ground, let us get in there. I don't want to go swimming, because I don't swim well with 86 pounds of steel on my body. But you're just plain scared. And I guess if you want to get right down to the nutty part of it, and where I always come back with a little theology is, do a lot of praying. You do a lot of praying. Get your scared stiff.
When we were coming in there, we got a few hundred yards from shore, and we're all standing up looking at the island, and watching the anti-aircraft shells bursting, and the dive bombers coming in and bombing Suribachi, and they're thinking, oh boy, I hope they kill all them Japs, But all of a sudden, boy, just bit, 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 over our head. Japanese machine gunner nailed our boat. Thank God it was a .30 caliber. The bullets sort of went through, but our boat got hit, and bullets went flying over our head, and we knew we were in war. This was a real thing.
And the Higgins boat has about that much steel on the front on the door when it goes down. But on the way in, they start hitting us with machine guns, of course. Well, that metal, if you can imagine, have been consistently banged at with big 50 caliber machine gun, but that is the loudest racket you'll ever hear. You can't hear a thing after the first minute. It's just, and the thought was, that thing's going to go down, and the door isn't going to stop any bullets coming in here, which is really a thought. Never went to church. I didn't believe in God, and just before we hit the beach, they quit. And that was my first time with God.
It all happened so fast, and that ramp goes down, you want to get the hell out of there, and then you do your best to get up to the beach, and it's just, it's almost impossible to describe, and just one of those things that you do it, and you can't go back, so you got to keep going.
The beach was only a few hundred yards long. It was not sand, it was debris from the volcanic eruption of Mount Suribachi. Sand packs, that never packs. Vehicles landed on there just had one heck of a time getting traction. Tanks and so forth would get halfway up to the ridge and they'd bog down. And we were a long time getting away from the beach itself. We hit that old beach and nothing but sand, just lava sand, 3 feet up and 2 feet back job, and scrambling for everything you can get, and all hell breaking loose.
General Kurabayashi's plan had been to let the Marines get up onto the central plateau before deluging them with artillery fire. But the steep beaches, the pounding surf, and the deep, soft volcanic ash that bogged down the vehicles and heavily laden Marines alike meant that the beaches became clogged with grounded landing craft, trapped vehicles, and struggling Marines. The target was irresistible, and the Japanese artillery fire rained down.
It was about 40 minutes, something like that. The Japanese didn't fire a round or anything. And we were very fortunate that they didn't open up, because after we got up there, they brought in some LSTs with ammunition, some light tanks, I think, on a couple of them. And they just took those and literally blew them to bits.
As we landed, the naval bombardment raised up 100 yards. We went at a ways, then raised up 100 yards. When it had raised up enough, then the artillery come out of their holes and their caves and really started blasting the 3rd, 4th, 5th wave. And then after that, the whole beach was a graveyard of ships and landing craft.
I think the first boats landed about 9:02. The first tractors hit the beach. And the official accounts say that the first 2 hours it was mostly pretty quiet. There wasn't much opposition, but by about 11 o'clock the Japanese were responding. You know, they were firing their artillery and mortars at the beach. They had it all pre-sighted, so we were under pretty heavy fire. And one of the first things I saw was a blockhouse, you know, a Japanese blockhouse that had been placed right by the beach with a big heavy machine gun in the front of it. And in front of this, in front of the embrasure, right under this machine gun that was still sticking out, there was one dead Marine with half his head blown off, you know. But he had obviously gone up there and just shoved a satchel charge into it to blow, you know, to just do everybody in, and it had done it. And his body was there. The other thing I'll just never forget about that beach was every few yards there'd be, you know, a shell hole or a foxhole. The Japanese had foxholes there. They'd already dug, you know, slit trenches, and there'd be a Marine body in there with a bullet through the helmet, obviously shot through the head.
We'd come ashore just a few yards, and I jumped in this hole. And there was a Marine sitting there, you know, kind of like this, slumped over. And I said, "How you doing, buddy?" And I kind of, you know, just pushed him up against the shoulder, and he just kind of rolled over, and he had this flash burn, this blue-grayish flash burn stuff on his face, and he'd been shot right between the eyes. And that was very horrifying for me, you know. That was my baptism.
Pure hell. I mean, there was so much destruction on the beach. Landing craft, half tracks, everything just all, you know, turned sideways, had been hit, blown up. The beach was so cluttered you could hardly find a point to get the landing craft into land. And there was a pretty good surf. It wasn't that bad that early in the morning, but there was a good surf that made it pretty difficult. And as we started moving on up, it was a pretty steep beach, all sand. And that's when you started feeling the old flamethrower. But you'd go up about 2 feet and slide back one, and just crawling and trying to keep down as low as you could. But when we got up there and looked back at the beach, it was impossible to describe the destruction. I've seen pictures of it, and I mean, they're actual. It's just, it was just ungodly. They had the beach pretty well zeroed in, and they could just sit back there and lob mortars and shells on it. But guys that made it from the beach were pretty lucky.
We went in there, and oh God, what a mess. We went up on the beach and we dug in there, and the damn Japs, they had everything coordinated with their cannons and whatever else they had, guns and stuff. Well, they were zeroed in on every part of that beach, and they shelled the hell out of us.
The Japs would walk down the beach, the artillery barrages walk down the beach and then back. A walking barrage. You never knew when you was going to get it. You didn't know where being on there. Iwo Jima was the front line. No matter where you were, it was the front line.
It was a bad day. The Japanese kept up a pretty heavy fire almost all the time, and by that we had no artillery ashore yet to fire back at them, and I think that we depended pretty much on the naval gunfire to keep them, you know, from firing at us. I think what saved us was the fact that the mortars, which would drop shells, the sand was such that they would penetrate the sand before they would detonate, you know. If it had been hard coral, the way it was at Peleliu or Saipan, it had been hard substance, I don't know if we would have made it, because they would have detonated right and have just probably wiped us all out.
Our platoon sergeant, Comstock, his buddy had just taken a bullet through the chest, and our corpsman started sewing him up, and then Comstock left to go up over the ridge, and a machine gun cut him down, and then a little bit later, Lieutenant Dyer was trying to get guys to start up, and he raised up to go and took a bullet through the head, and Those are all first day experiences.
Tried to get the hell off that black beach, which was, we just couldn't hardly move in it. That black sands, it was just one step forward and two steps back. But finally, you knew you had to get off that beach because they were just shelling the hell out of us. Sniper fire coming off Suribachi and up off of the ridge there to our right.
We ended up, I suppose, about half of my platoon in a 16-inch shell hole after we had gotten ashore and kind of counting noses, and I climbed up the uphill side of this big crater to observe what was ahead of us, which were the terraces of Iwo. I got up there and I saw a young Marine just within 6-8 feet of me, and I suddenly realized that the only part of him that was there was just his head, and that's when from then on I knew what we were doing.
There were some times when we just couldn't move at all, we were just pinned down and had to be underground or we would just be blown away. Then for some reason it would ease up, I think that I always figured that the Japanese would have to come out of their caves to fire, and that they'd be visible, and the people offshore could spot them and then direct gunfire to just where they were, and they'd have to quit and go back in their holes. Then they'd come out again in a different place and repeat the process, but meantime we were getting pounded, and we had lost an awful lot of people that day.
Went on a little further and met up with my two buddies, and there was a pillbox in front of us, and I went up close and I peeked in and saw this Jap looking at me about 6 feet away, and I blasted him right in the face with my 45. That was my first one. During that same period, a airplane, the Corsair, the blue Corsair Jobs, came right over us real low. Right up in front I saw a HACAC gun come up out of a hole, and this Corsair just froze on his guns and just turned over like that and crashed into an Amtrak in the fourth wave of Marines. That was devastating to me.
I'll never forget that night because the Japanese would walk their rounds, across the beach. They would fire mortars, and you'd hear shells exploding about maybe 100 yards off this way, and the next one closer, and the next one closer. And every so often you hear somebody yelling who got hit, and then it would come closer, and you figure, well, the next one's going to be right on top of me, and then it'd be at the other side. You just, well, I'm saved this time, and then they'd walk on, and then it would come back, and every time they came back, you think, am I going to be next?
I can remember my attitude very clearly. I say, hell, they can't hurt me. And after a bit, I could look around and say, I hope they don't hurt me. And a short while later, I was saying, I hope I don't get killed.
We kept digging and digging and digging in the side of that airship there, but they were just shelling the hell out of us and shooting at us. And yeah, that was a pretty terrifying experience. Pretty terrifying.
The Marines, by the end of the first day, had cut off Suribachi and were up to the edge of airfield number 1. And although they had already landed nearly 30,000 men, no small accomplishment given the difficult conditions on the beaches, they had already suffered 2,400 casualties. It was already clear this was not going to be easy. By the end of the second day, thanks in part to the effects of the Sherman tanks that had landed, the first airfield was in Marine hands, and the 28th Regiment of the 5th Division was preparing to assault Suribachi itself. But another 1,000 Marines had been killed or wounded. Sitting on the southernmost tip of Iwo Jima, the volcanic cone of Mount Suribachi rose nearly straight up, completely dominating the landing beaches. It was the job of the 28th Marine Regiment of the 5th Marine Division to take it.
It took us the third day till we might say Suribachi was surrounded. It was a very short distance, just hundreds of yards, and it's difficult to understand until you think of Suribachi as being a man-made fortress that is hanging over your head, and every time you took your pants down to pee, they could see you, and you were exposed all of the time. The only reason that we were able to survive long,
whatever else we thought they might need, and hiked up on top of it. Oh my God, that's a long ways up there, you know. And there were Japs all over the place. We wondered we didn't get shot. But anyway, we got up there and we distributed the stuff, gave it to the guys that were up there. And while we were there, they put the big flag up. Rosenthal, I think his name was Rosenthal, the guy who took the picture. You know, they always said that was staged, but it wasn't. He was standing there talking to a guy, and this guy says, "Oh my God," he said, "they're putting the flag up." And he turned around and snapped the picture, not even looked. And that's what he got.
I did see the flag going up. That was great. The third day was horrible rain, you know, just the third or fourth day, I can't remember which, but it was just rainy and miserable. And then it cleared. The next day it cleared. And I remember Red Beach was about maybe 1,200 yards the crow flies from the top of Suribachi. And somebody pointed up and says, "Look, there's a flag up there." So I looked up and sure as hell there's this flag, you know, and waving in blue sky. And I was really delighted to see that.
I guess it was about D+4, drizzly morning. We couldn't see because the rain kept coming down the periscopes, and so we turned off our engines and opened the hatches a little bit, hoping we could hear this rumored Japanese counterattack with tanks, but it never materialized. And then somebody alerted us to the fact that we should turn around and look at Suribachi. And there was that flag flying. And it was a great sight.
Actually, I didn't see it go up. Of course, by this time we had moved in a little closer. But the word came out, and where we were receiving the wounded was on the starboard side, and this was, Suribachi was on the port side, so as people have said, it's a wonder that all the ships didn't capsize because everybody was rushing over to that side. And I remember there was an officer standing there with field glasses around his neck, and I don't believe I said, "May I use your field glasses, sir?" But I did get a good view of the flag. It was up there. What you could see, of course, was this, at that distance, a very tiny fluttering of the red and the white up there above the smoke of the battle.
It was the most joyful, enlightening event that could have happened. Every Marine on the island jumped up and screamed, and we knew at that time that we would eventually take the island, but there was still, it took a month.
The raising of the flag should have been the fitting climax of the Marine victory. After all, the whole operation was supposed to be over in 3 or 4 days. Unfortunately, rather than the end, it was only the beginning of a terrible and bloody battle of attrition. Of the 6 men who raised the flag and appeared in Rosenthal's famous picture, 3 would die before the fighting on the island was over. The fighting would now continue, with the Japanese forcing the Marines to pay a price for every square foot of volcanic ash and cinder. Every cave, every tunnel, every fold of ground seemed to contain more snipers, more machine guns, more hidden mines. After Suribachi fell, the next objective was to seize the two airfields and then assault north to seize the high plateau in the center of the island. The 5th Division attacked on the left, up the east side of the island, aiming for Kitano Point at the north end of Iwo Jima, and the complex of cave-riddled ravines that was to be named Bloody Gorge. On the eastern side of the island, the 4th Marines carried the fight. They had landed to the right of the 5th Marines, and after taking Airfield No. 1, they wheeled north to take Motoyama Airfield. Overlooking the airfield was a ridge that would come to be known as the Meat Grinder. It had various features, including Turkey Knob, the amphitheater, and Hill 382. Once the 4th Marines made it past the Meat Grinder, they would face the rough scrub-covered country of the high plateau until they could reach their final objective, Takiwa Point and the sea. Between the 4th and 5th Marines, parts of the 3rd Marine Division would fight. Their job would be to storm Motoyama Airfield, take what was left of the village of Motoyama, and seize what would be called Cushman's Pocket. Casualties mounted, and the front-line strength of the Marines dwindled until companies were being commanded by corporals, and reinforced battalions that began the battle 2 weeks before with 1,000 men were hard-pressed to line up 100 weary Marines in the front line. The fighting was constant, bitter, costly, and slow.
The battle was basically fought uphill in the sense that the Japanese had the high ground and the extended fields of vision and fire, and the only way Marines were going to save themselves was to get up there and take those positions away, one body at a time. So it was hard fought every foot of the place. I mean, guys in the quote rear area were as vulnerable as anybody out front because, you know, if that's where a Japanese gun on the heights was sighted, then that's where it was going to shoot. So there was no rear area in the normal sense of the word. There was no place to run in, no place to hide.
It's really not true where they had a main line of defense. Every 100 yards was another main line of defense. And they just went from one set of bunkers to another set of bunkers, another set of spider traps and pillboxes, and most of them were interlaced with tunnels.
The casualties were very bad taking Suribachi, but our outfits had worse casualties in what was ahead of us as we went north. The advances in the roughly a month that it took to go from there to Kitano Point were measured in 50, 100, 150, 200 yards. It was not a line that you think of as trench warfare in World War I. The front was a quarter of a mile deep. You might be more dangerous a quarter of a mile back from the farthest point of advance because of all of the tunneling and caves and outposts they have, some of which there were enemy soldiers there who had been left intentionally to disrupt the rear part of our advance. And every crack and every crevice was potentially an enemy.
And looked and for them, but we just crawling on our bellies there. We just couldn't find them because they were so well concealed. The Japs weren't on Iwo Jima, they were in Iwo Jima. They were down as far as 5 stories in the ground, and tunnels went all over the island. So they didn't have to fight us up on top. They would fight us from concealed caves. Maybe there would be a little opening in the cave, just enough for an enemy soldier to put his rifle through it and shoot you. You couldn't see him.
They would build in the sides of cliffs. They would come out a cave and they would build a squatting position, which was flat at the bottom, and it was curved like some of the little amphitheaters are, only it was the size of a person. And they would sit there cross-legged. We would scan the cliffs, and they would sit there immobilized. And we learned to scan and scan, and when you found one, they wouldn't move until you shot them. If you shot them and missed, they moved, but we didn't miss too often.
You know, they were in caves and pillboxes, and you had to work your way through that whole maze of caves and pillboxes. There was very little open area where you got up and moved for any length of time, in the daylight anyhow. It was a hands and knees operation.
We started getting these little guys right out of boot camp virtually, you know, no exposure to anything, you know, and then try to get them somewhere where they may be able to fend for themselves and protect themselves as best as you can. Johnny, I said, I can't be with you all the time. These are the things you have to look out for. These are what you have to do if you're going to survive in this silly mess. And I said, it is. It's just a silly mess. But if you don't keep your eyes and your ears open, you'll be one of the guys that'll be on a stretcher and they'll be hauling you out. And I hope that that's what it is. I hope it isn't any worse than that. But if you don't, you know, and they're sitting there shaking, they're scared to death.
They broke us up into smaller and smaller groups until finally there was a guy, I think it was Sergeant Kincaid, said, this here is G Company. Now we're going to move out in a straight line. When you see a Jap, shoot the son of a bitch. It ain't going to be no straight line, so don't shoot no Marines. Let's go. And that was it. So we moved out, and I took cover under a rock, I guess about 2-3 feet tall. And after a while, I stuck my head up, and the rock started to disintegrate as the machine gun bullets bit into it. And I thought it might be nice to get a nice flesh wound. And I could hear some mortars coming down over to my right. And suddenly the word came, pull back, pull back. So I pulled back. I jumped into a hole with a guy with a gray face and, you know, like a Hollywood hole. I said, this is no place for a minister's son. And he said, it's no place for anybody. And he was right.
But then it just kept, you know, inching up the island, and I guess what was it, the 8th day we were at the old 362, was kind of in the middle of the island, a little on the other side we were on. It was a real tough one. And that was the first time that I'd experienced an overhead shelling up close. I mean, they were firing right on top. I mean, for 15 minutes, just constant, just shook the earth. And we couldn't figure out how to even possibly be a live chap in there. But anyhow, we got in there and started cleaning out some caves, and I got hit in the leg, luckily, and shrapnel went in about the middle of the thigh and down behind my knee, and got evacuated on the 8th day. And I think probably that saved my life. I mean, there were so many close calls, you just wonder how any of them ever got through.
One day, mortars came down on us. And that's what Sweeney said much later, years and years later on. I thought it was our own artillery. But it was bam, 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 bam. And I was deaf, and I bounced. And then it stopped, and Sweeney was buried under a pile of rock. And he got up screaming because his leg was in shreds. I had a little scratch. I was nearer to him than I am to you.
I said, move out. And he stood up and took one step, man, and the bullet came right over my ear, hit him in the back. Yeah? And down he went. And I'd never seen anyone with a bullet wound before. Well, he's down on his face. So I rip off his jacket, and there's this little hole in his back. And I said, Beatty, you be okay. I turned him over, and of course the bullet had come out and torn everything out. And the blood was just pumping out. And God, I screamed for 15 minutes, but no corpsman around. He looked up at me and my arms kicked off.
We lost people unbelievably there. And the Japs, contrary to what you hear, are very good shots. We had a high percentage of head wounds there. And word was passed before we went overseas, and commonly passed media-wise, that the Japs were nearsighted and not good shots. Well, given a healthy Jap, they were good shots. They had a lot of people that knew how to handle their weapon.
I'm talking to Nick. Nick gets shot in the head, while I'm talking to him, and I tell the captain, really pinned down, Captain, we can't do much. He said, well, one of those situations, the outfits on either side are moving ahead, so we got to keep pressure on them. If everybody stops, so there's no pressure, and they'll have to pull back if they make it. So we got to keep attacking. I said, okay. So I tell the man, Lieutenant, well, there's no way we can do it. I said, I'll go first. The captain said, we got to go. We got to try. I said, I'll go first, and you guys follow me if I make any progress. So I don't get up and walk. I just sort of what they call snoop and poop. I stay as low as I can. I go about zigzag about 15 feet, and bang! I hear this noise. I've hit through the helmet, So I'm on my hands and knees, and I see blood, and then I hear a noise like somebody cranking something, and then I hear the guy say, "Move, get out of the fire lane, Lieutenant, get out, move." So I roll, I get behind a rock, and the guys all fire, the barman and the machine gun all fire, and I sort of crawl back.
Barney didn't smoke, but he liked coffee, and he liked a lot of this other stuff, and he had a whole lot of these packets between his helmet and his helmet liner. I came back to the CP, and one of the guys said, Chief, you've got to see Barney. I said, what's the matter? He said, he got shot in the head. So I went on farther, and here was Barney sitting there. And he had this silly grin on his face. He said, you won't believe it, Chief. And he took off his helmet, and right above his ear there was a neat hole through the helmet. And it had hit some of those packets. It made a groove right around the top of his head, just almost cut the liner right around, hit some more packets, and exited on the other side. So there were two holes just like this.
We got up to where there were about 45 of us left, and a lieutenant was assigned to us for us to pull a bonsai charge up through this gorge. I went back and was sent back and brought up 3 tanks. And we took those 3 tanks and we just started blasting up through there. Our lieutenant, he was a football player with the New York Giants. And he got out there and he could throw those hand grenades, and he was just a bullet. He got out there and throwing hand grenades and shooting, and then he stepped on a landmine and blew his legs off above his paratrooper boots. And I went over and laid down beside him, and he said, well, I won't play more football, will I?
John Koski got hit by machine gun fire one night, and I helped take his body back to the collecting station. We were all laid out with poncho over their faces, and the boondockers sticking out. He was engaged to a girl by the name of Jeannie Adams in Quincy, Massachusetts. I always wondered what happened. You wonder what happened to their wives. You wonder what happened to their girls. Did they marry? Did they remarry? God, they were all great-grandmothers now, I guess.
One place in particular, we were getting closer to the ending of the thing. There was just a cordwood supply of dead Japs piled up. I mean, they were piled up just like cordwood, and we had to be right next to them. We were there for 3 days, and you get the ugly. Then you get the ugly smell of war. the ugly smell. And I don't know. I just, I know I was totally happy to have gotten off the thing and got off in one piece.
Then the 5 of us walked up path back up to this ridge, and the last one stepped on a landmine. Saw his name. Blew one leg off, one arm off, put his eyes out. As we was carrying him out there, he said, "I'm lucky. I'm at least leaving this island alive."
Night brought no reprieve for the weary Marines. The Japanese defenders would emerge from their caves and tunnels, infiltrating American lines to take up positions behind them, and sometimes attacking the Marines in their holes. The fight continued in the dark.
And during the nighttime, you'd look out and you'd see the steam coming up from the and parachute flares swinging down like this, and Japs sneaking in like that. It was a weird place to fight.
It was not a good night. We had a lot of attempted infiltration during the night. You know, we had they always put K-ration tents strung in the wire, so if anybody tried to get through, we could hear them rattle, and there were grenades going off all night.
I was sitting there, back up against the rocks there, and I heard tinkle, 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 you know, oh Christ. And I let off the safety on the old carbine, and this white thing. Well, the Japs used to wear them underneath their hats to keep the dirt and stuff out. And I seen this white thing come over the edge of that rock, and I emptied that carbine into that son of a bitch. It was just a flare that went out, a parachute flare, you know.
We had 2 corpsmen over in the next foxhole, and they saw 2 Japs walking up at them. "Who's that? Who's that?" "Oh, it's just me." And then one Jap, they saw the Jap, and they run over, and one of them jumped in the foxhole with him, but the corpsman managed to kill him, and the Jap grabbed the other corpsman by the leg, and he's there with his shovel beat. "Shoot him again, Murrah, shoot him again." "Ah, he's already dead. That's all right, shoot him again." And the other one had stopped. A parachute flare popped exactly that same instant. I could see this Jap crouched down over close to them, and I took him out. And then the Jap charged me. I let him get about 10 feet from me, and I whomped him. But at the exact same moment that I shot him, a hand grenade went off underneath my rifle and exploded and filled my eyes with dust and cut up my hands. And I looked up, and here's that other Jap, second Jap, coming in with a samurai sword. They'd killed the other 2 guys, and he was close. And I really couldn't do anything about it, but one of my next buddies hit him with a BAR and knocked him over. And then the rest of the night was the same way, just all night long. They would come in, and we would kill, and they would kill, and we would kill. And then we spent about 4 days out there in those last foxholes. And like I say, we were down to about 12 guys, and the Marines broke through to us, and a Marine came up and asked me, "Hey, where is Corporal Hoffman and his buddy?" And I said, "Oh, they're over in the next foxhole. The Japs killed him." And then I noticed this guy that was talking to me was my next door neighbor from Pendleton. And I thought, hey, there's a real world out there, not just sand and Japs.
Working closely with the Marines on the ground, the tanks, especially those equipped with flamethrowers, proved to be an essential element to success on Iwo Jima.
Tankers are only happy when they're inside their tank. It's a psychological situation, if you can think of it. All of your time you ride around protected by all this steel. And if they have to escape, they are just frightened to death. They don't want to be outside of that tank. And we came to understand that, and they couldn't understand how we could walk around out there and do our job.
We appreciated the tanks, but the Iwo was such a place that tanks didn't move very well because there's so much sand and rocks. I mean, tons of rocks, big rocks, and tanks had trouble with that. But it was great to take shelter against.
We had one bulldozer tank in each platoon, I think it was, or in each company. And the idea was to protect that bulldozer to keep the Japanese from blowing that blade off, because there were no roads. And once the bulldozer blade was off, the game was over until we could get that blade welded back on. And in the meantime, the Japanese would hit us with mortars, and we'd try to find the mortar positions and fire back at them. And you'd sit there on a road, you had no way to go sideways, and you try to outguess them as, oh, all right, move forward 50. That one came right down our tail, move forward 50. And the next one would be 10 yards in front of you. All right, move back 10. And just try to outguess whoever the mortarman was until they knocked him out. The infantry had knocked him out. But we were nothing more than mobile pillboxes.
Went ashore and went immediately up onto airfield number 2, I believe it was. And just set up there like he was out on a billiard table, and they were shooting at us with mortars and artillery, but it didn't hurt the tank. You could hear it, you could feel it, but it didn't damage the tank any. You could see where we'd been hit. And this was the same day that I don't remember whether it was 2 or 3 of our tanks did get knocked out by this anti-aircraft gun. And he was buried where he could just shoot straight ahead. He had a very small line of fire. And we overran his position the next day and found it, the gun, and our boys had moved down and got their nose out there too far, and he picked them off.
They had some good gunners. We got into one line of tanks going up the center of the island. I think they were 3rd Division tanks. And if you can imagine a vehicle coming at you this way, and they hit every one of them in the drive on the right-hand side. They were that accurate.
That first morning when this tank in our platoon, or our company got hit, our platoon got hit, the driver was a good friend of mine, Robert Von Meggy, who lives in Los Angeles. And Von was the driver. And to my memory, now this may be an embellishment, I don't know, but it's a good story. We had the throat mics for intercommunication, and Von thought that we were on intercom, and actually we were outgoing. And so his message was heard all over the island and beyond. It was, lay off, you bastards, I'm a lover, not a fighter.
I take a look at those guys and know the risks that they took. Because when you're an object like that, you are just something humongous for everything and everybody to shoot at.
We went up the next morning and told the driver to stay in our same tracks. We were able to pick those up. And because we hadn't hit a mine the day before. He had no sooner said that than boom. I never heard it. I woke up, I was laying on the turret floor bleeding like a stuck pig. And the tank I remember it was filled with dust. I heard some moaning down in front. It was Burris, the assistant driver. The other 3 guys had already left, not a scratch on them. There was no question about evacuating Burris. I didn't want to get evacuated, and to this day, I don't know whether I refused evacuation because I didn't want to leave my friends, or I was afraid of being put in an infantry replacement outfit.
A Jap was laying in the brush right beside the road, and he jumped up and threw a satchel charge underneath my tank. Well, you heard that and you felt that. And my driver and assistant driver, they had their heads out, and I was talking to a scout. I had the hatch open, I was talking to the scout, and this scout hollered and said, watch out, and I just dropped down inside, but I didn't get the hatch closed. And that probably helped my hearing, because it blew everything out, and the dust flew and the smoke flew, and it knocked out one of our engines. We had twin Jimmy diesels, and it knocked out one of the engines.
Maybe about the 17th day, I was sent back to bring up some tanks. And we bring them up to the front line, and then you assign a spotter to spot for them. And they either on the side telephone, usually the telephone, and then, like I say, this one guy climbed up on top and got shot off, but the tanks don't have the visibility that the man on the ground does. And so you're sticking your head up trying to find the pillboxes and then direct the tanks to fire.
Well, I've talked to a lot of infantry guys, and the tanks were a mixed blessing. They needed us to knock out the pillboxes and the other fortifications, but when we were near them, we drew an awful lot of mortar fire, just like honey-drawn flies. And the infantry, the mortars didn't bother us nearly as much as they bothered the unprotected infantry. But we had that telephone, and they would point out targets to us. It was very close.
We're sitting there, and we had some infantry around us, and we had hooked up with a telephone, and it was hooked up to our radio so this infantry could talk to us. And we're sitting there, and this lieutenant came on, and he says, "There's a pillbox at 3 o'clock." So I traverse around, and I look, and I don't see any pillbox. So I told the gunner, I says, "Fire an HE up there," and he did. Well, that blew all the camouflage off, and there was a pillbox. But it was pointed out to sea. It was a coastal gun. And so then we put an APHE through it, and because it was on the back side, and blew the roof fell in on it.
When they finally figured out how to arm them and fire napalm fuel into cave where they could run those babies right up to the mouth of a cave and just shoot it full. That, to me, is one of the most insidious things we had in the war at that time, was napalm. Flamethrowers, ugly stuff.
Fourth or fifth day, they started getting some flamethrower tanks up, and they could fire about 5 minutes, and they could fire about 100 yards. And man, they could sit there and just burn out caves and emplacements, which helped a heck of a lot.
There were some Jap infantry right ahead of us in foxholes, and they were holding our infantry back. Every time the guys had moved, they'd throw hand grenades out. So our tank had a flamethrower that we could pull the lap gun out, which was a 30 caliber machine gun, and put this flamethrower in the same place and shoot it. And it had about a 30-gallon capacity, but it wouldn't shoot very far, But anyway, we used that, and we just hosed the area down there in front of us, and these Japs come up out of there just like popcorn, and cleaned them right out of there.
The vehicle that the Japanese concentrated mostly on was the tanks with the flamethrower, and you could tell that one because it had a barrel underneath the barrel, and that was the flamethrower. And that's the ones they went after.
We just kept on fighting northbound, and we got up to a place called Cushman's Pocket, and that was pretty tough going up there, and that's when our flamethrowers became pretty important, because they could shoot this flame, I would say 300 or 400 feet, and they'd shoot a big stream of that stuff up into these caves and burn the Japs out, and it was very effective.
But there were many places on Iwo Jima where tanks just couldn't go. To destroy the defenders in a cave or a hidden pillbox, the Marines usually had to go in very close. One of the most fearsome weapons available was a flamethrower that could be carried on the back of one Marine, but it was very heavy and conspicuous. A man operating one had to get close, and as he crawled forward, he was more than likely to become a target for every Japanese sniper and machine gunner in the area. And the operator could hardly forget that right on his back were tanks full of napalm.
poor guys, that was suicide, yeah. Because of flamethrower, you couldn't move very well. And they were just picked off like crazy. Yeah. I mean, the flamethrower is great for getting people out of caves and so forth and so on. But boy, the guy to get up to the cave, he's got a problem. Huh? Because it's like a tank. It attracts a lot of attention. And he doesn't move very well, and he doesn't have any armor. Yeah?
The flamethrower, without the napalm, it would just blow, it would just maybe go out 20, 30 feet and just one big flame. But with the napalm in it, you had a range of about 50 feet maximum and more effective in 20, 30 feet. And you could shoot, like you had a full tank was 10 seconds if you held it complete on. But you tried to use short bursts. That's all it really took was, a good one good burst could do a whole lot. But it was cumbersome, but you kind of got used to it.
We worked with the flamethrower people at the base of Suribachi, and working up to the base, there are lots of little canyons, and I'm speaking of canyons maybe are 10 foot wide and 6 foot deep or 8 foot deep, and the nips had tunneled in at angles all along those places, and then they had lateral tunnels, so they were all connected. And you needed to have somebody hold those nips in place while we could get munition or explosives up there to place in those holes and get rid of them. And the flamethrowers were the best. We would give a short time, and they would give a burst of their flamethrower. We'd be ready, have a charge ready, and go up and throw 3 or 4 of them in the holes and just keep working up.
Somehow in our platoon, I got a hold of the flamethrower, and I became the guy. And it was a pretty effective weapon for what we were going to be doing, and you almost had to do it to approach any kind of a pillbox replacement. I mean, you just, as it turned out on Iwo, you were so exposed all the time that just without that, it would have been almost impossible to wipe out some of the emplacements.
The flamethrower and the flamethrower tanks were key to getting well-entrenched Japanese troops out into the open. However, the Marines also had other help just offshore. When the weather permitted, naval aviators flew their fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in to hit the heavily dug-in Japanese.
You're given a pretty good briefing before you take off. We have a combat intelligence center on the ship, and they would say that this was where these people were, and they would give you the coordinates. You'd put those on a map, and so when you left, you knew pretty well what to look for and where that was. In fact, you not only knew pretty well, you knew where to look. But the Japs, instead of going in deeper, they just went into caves and those rocks. And it really got tough on those Marines, really got tough. So what we did to take care of that was we dropped napalm. And that takes the oxygen out of the air. And you drop that in one of those caves, why, that'd bring out a lot of those Japs right there.
We were carrying 1,000-pound blockbusters, they called them. And the first trip, just dropped the thing straight on the target. But soon that target was firing again. And then the next day we went back, and they had learned by then that you don't drop them straight down, you skip bomb that right into the opening. And that got things awful quiet in a hurry.
We would strafe, and we had rockets. We had the 5-inch rockets that we fired. But the Iwo was so many tunnels, and I'm sure we kept them down in the tunnels until we left, probably, or at night. But no, we spent 3 or 4 flights because we were only 80 miles away from them. We could fly in, and they had forward air controllers that call you in. And,
say, you got a square grid map, say go to a certain grid and you'll see the panels, strafe to the west or whatever is away from them. But that's when you like to be a pilot. When you see them ground founders, they really suffered on a place like Iwo.
You can see a lot of movement. If there's troops down there, you can see all that movement because you're down there pretty low. You're down there when you release your bombs. You're not skip bombing, but right next to it, maybe 400 feet, maybe 250 feet, something like that. So you actually see what's right there.
Meanwhile, the Navy continued to stand just offshore, shelling Japanese positions.
They were practically on the beach, firing at the pillboxes, and then that's the first time we saw those rocket launchers, the LCIs or the LSTs with the rockets on them, LCIs and LSTs. And that was unbelievable to see those things start firing, whoosh, just a whole 1,000 of them almost. But yeah, the destroyers worked right up on the beach practically. But the cruisers and battleships sat offshore there, especially during while I was there, just constant support.
We were usually attached to, and in most cases with us it happened to be the Marines, to a Marine fire control officer who would give us targets to fire at. And usually we operated together with about 5 or 6 ships. And we got some notice that we had been effective in helping prevent counterattack and from the Marines, and that's high praise indeed.
The ships at first were subject to some Japanese artillery fire, but on the evening of the second day, another threat materialized. 50 kamikaze aircraft of the 2nd Milate Special Attack Unit came winging in through the darkening skies. 2 of them slammed into the sides of the Grand Old Lady of the Pacific Fleet, the USS Saratoga. Wounded once again, the aircraft carrier was forced to limp back to Pearl Harbor, out of action for the rest of the war. Another kamikaze hit the escort carrier USS Bismarck C, detonating several of the aircraft crowded on its deck. Soon the stricken ship rolled over and sank. Other Japanese air attacks struck repeatedly at the American ships offshore. Most were knocked down by vigilant combat air patrols or dense anti-aircraft fire, but not all.
About 4 ships ahead of us, and then in another column there was another 4 or 5 ships, and we're just doing 2 knots, just steerage. And the next thing you know, the ship ahead of it had a big explosion, and then the ship ahead of it had a big explosion. All these ships were being attacked. We were under attack from kamikazes. And so, as soon as I saw that, I was up on deck, and I'm the gunner, and I'm pushing the general quarters button, trying to get my headset on. And the LST ahead of us was hit in the bow. She was burning. A cook came out from the stern and got on a 20 millimeter, and I remember he had this white apron on. He came from the galley, and he had that thing, and he was firing at this plane coming in at us with this aviation gasoline. He never hit the plane, but it distracted the pilot. And we had a conning tower that went up, and then there was the bow of the ship, and he went between, and I looked into his face, and he just hit the water on the other side of it would be on the starboard side of the ship. And when he hit, I remember it cut him in 2 because part of him stayed in, the other half he bubbled around in the water. But he missed us, and we had aviation gasoline and these big tankers. And we would have been fried chicken in a matter of seconds.
I was standing on the fantail, and I looked up and I saw this plane coming in. And I thought, well, that's got to be one of ours. I didn't have any idea it'd be a kamikaze. until he got down close enough, and then he winged over and dove into the side of the ship. Now, if he'd have kept coming the way he was going, he would have hit the stern and knocked out the propellers and crippled the ship completely, but he didn't, and he didn't fire a shot at us, just blew himself up, and he killed quite a few Marines too, and a lot of sailors, because it hit right in the crew's quarters.
These attacks were but a preview of things to come. The kamikaze raids would continue, reaching their apex during the invasion of Okinawa a short time later. The Marines paid a heavy price to take the 8 square miles of stinking volcanic soil. 5,885 Marines were killed on Iwo Jima, and another 17,272 were wounded.
Everybody had been wounded to some degree, all of us. The wounds were, unless they were serious, didn't warrant time to write out a Purple Heart. I would say everyone in the platoon was wounded sufficiently in average combat that they would have been awarded a Purple Heart. That's the way the situation was. And we weren't there to get Purple Heart.
Taking care of the wounded were the corpsmen. The corpsmen were part of the Navy, and it was their job to crawl out under fire and retrieve the wounded, give them first aid, and get them back to the surgical hospitals. The corpsmen suffered heavy casualties and were dearly loved by the Marines they served.
You were literally a target out there. And one of the things that they were starting to do near the very end, as I recall, was that the Japanese started looking at the Marines, we will say, were out there, and they figured out that anyone who was carrying a .45 on their hip was either an officer, a non-commissioned officer, or a corpsman. And so some of these guys started rigging up shoulder holsters, but a number of them also picked up the M1s and the carbines and so forth, so that they looked basically like anyone else.
You read stories about a corpsman going out, exposing himself, treating a guy and dragging him back. This guy did it 50 times, 75 times. And they were the greatest, absolutely the greatest.
We did have a number of them who were killed, including the fellow that climbed Suribachi with me. And he was, oddly enough, he was killed while he'd very carefully gone out to where this person was, who he thought was wounded. And they said that just as he reached up to touch him, there was a sniper who had him zeroed in, and he had one of those light machine guns and fired 4 shots, and he killed him. So, and that happened on a number of occasions. While trying to take care of the wounded, of course, they were also hit.
One of the things I remember best about that first night I spent in the field hospital, the tent hospital on Iwo, the division hospital, they brought a guy in who looked half dead. He was just gray, and they wheeled him into a tent, and a couple of hours later, the same guy comes out alive and kicking, pink, and waking and, tugging at things, very much alive. And I said, what happened? He said, well, he was badly shot, and the corpsman told me, he said, they worked on him, they got him transfused, and they got him fixed up, so he's going to be all right. And that made a tremendous impression on me. Here somebody looks half dead, and I thought, wow,
We were getting a succession of, various types of wounds. The one thing that I do recall is that the first time in my life that I ever saw an amputation, I was holding on to the leg that they were amputating. It was, it's kind of odd. I can't really explain it, but it's as though I had, in a sense, detached myself. I focused on what I was doing, and then when I was through with that, when something else came up, and I would pass on to that. Later you start thinking about it, but at the time you don't have the luxury of doing that.
Including all the casualties among the sailors and naval aviators who supported the landings, the total came to 6,821 dead, 19,217 wounded, and 2,648 cases of combat fatigue, for a total of 28,686 American casualties. Of the 22,000 or so Japanese defenders, nearly all died, with 1,083 surrendering, most of them badly wounded soldiers or Korean laborers. Better than 1 out of 3 Marines who died in World War II died on Iwo Jima, and more than 27 medals of honor were awarded for the outstanding bravery on Iwo, more than a third of such medals to be awarded to Marines in World War II.
We started getting ready for the battle on Okinawa. But we only had 55% of our division left, so we were held in reserve in case they needed us. And then this lieutenant come right out of OCS. He says, "Don't worry, guys, we got another fight coming up. You guys will get your share." I looked at him. I said, "We've had our share, sir."
We got a lot of casualties there. More than got, I think about 20,000 we lost there, somewhere in that neighborhood. Why I'm here, I don't know. I think the guy upstairs was looking out for me. There's no reason.
Don't question anything. Don't question an order. Don't question why somebody else got killed or somebody else got injured or whatever it is. Just be thankful that you didn't. And it's the only way you can survive. Otherwise, you go completely off your rock.
We did sea burials there. They'd be placed on stretchers. Maybe you'd have 20 stretchers here with corpses prepared. We'd blow taps. The bodies would slide out from under a flag, which was folded, carefully folded, and sent to the next of kin.
In memories you'd like to forget, but yet I want to remember them. I want to remember my buddies that I left there.
The fighting on Iwo Jima was some of the most intense in World War II. Most of the Marines who saw their first action there would be deeply affected by it for the rest of their lives. Day or night, at the front or behind, death could come from anywhere. The Marines could never relax the whole time they were there. That kind of stress and fear and fatigue changes you forever. Some would find faith, and others would lose it.
The lieutenant gets on his radio to bring in some artillery to lift the siege we're having so he can attack again. And the radio quits. So he says, "Copeland, take this message back to the artillery. These are the coordinates." And man, if you can believe, machine guns, mortars, everything, man, they're just banging away, rifles. And I thought, shit, this is it, man. And so I took off and ran. I hadn't had any sleep, of course, since we hit the island. And this was the second day. And I'm tired. So I've run about, maybe 50 feet. And I couldn't do it anymore. I said, fuck it, kill me, man. And it was almost big giant hand put up. It was just like that. Everything went right around me. Never touched me. So that was the second time knew God.
There's also the 5th island I landed on. And I can sit here today and gracefully say, I made a deal with the Almighty. I never got a scratch. In all the stuff I did, never got a scratch. But I lay in a foxhole on that thing and watched the flag go up on top of Mount Surabaki, and I says, hey, get me out of all of this stuff here, and when you need me, give me a call.
And I remember so well thinking, should I pray? Then it's not going to make a damn bit of difference if I pray or not. If it's going to hit me, it's going to hit me. I'm not going to pray and see what happens. And that's what I did. I never got hit and I never prayed, so I've always remembered that. A lot of guys did pray, and I felt good for them that they prayed because it made them feel better. I didn't think it helped them any because I saw people praying and get shot while they were praying. There was a chaplain that said there are no atheists in foxholes, and I found a few atheists in foxholes. I didn't think they were any worse than anybody else.
For some, the reality of the situation was too much to handle, and while many would commit acts of selfless humanity, others would seemingly become inhuman.
Going up the beach, 2 Marines away from us, they shot each other in the foot. And then they called a corpsman to get them out of there. Then the Japs killed the corpsman. And talk about bad-mouthing those 2 Marines. I don't know whatever happened to them, but they just did a bad thing and it cost lives.
I also found a tent where there were about 5 Japanese prisoners who were surrounded by a tremendous amount of barbed wire, you know, a thicket of it about 5 feet thick. And they were all lying there flat out, you know. The only Japanese that were captured that I know of were so badly wounded they couldn't resist being captured, you know. And these guys were badly wounded. And the barbed wire, of course, to keep our guys out, not to keep them in. It was that kind of a war, just inhuman. Didn't think of the Japanese as human, you know. I was really, I won't say brainwashed, but I was programmed to figure that they were to be exterminated, you know.
When I wake up, there's a 50-gallon oil drum there, and there's steam coming out of the top of it. And I said, well, hey, what you guys doing? They said, hey, we're collecting skulls and making necklaces. I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, come on, I'll show you. So I go over and take the lid off the 50-gallon oil drum, and the water is boiling, and there's skulls bobbing up and down on it, you know. The hair, some of the hair wasn't off them, but all the eyes, they popped the eyes out and stuff like that. And I thought, well, that was interesting. He said, you know, we make a lot of money at this. I said, how do you do that? He said, well, the sailors go crazy when you go aboard the ship. I mean, you get all kinds of money. Huh? And I'll never forget how I could become an animal. Huh? It's just an animal.
Still others were faced with the fact that the Japanese weren't the savage animals that they had been led to believe.
We came to a busted-out, blown-out cave, and you knew what officers had been there because there were suitcases. Enlisted men don't take suitcases in any army. And it was full of books and papers, and also letters and drawings that kids in kindergarten or the first grade make. And they were of Japanese planes with the meatball on them flying over rice fields and the sun shining down, you know, with the rays coming down. And it occurred to me for the first time, these people have children. They have children who love them and send them mail.
My other brothers who never went to Japan maintained an animosity against them for a long, long time. But I felt real blessed that I got to leave my hatred overseas and not have to bring it home with me.
Finally, it was over. After 36 days of continuous banging, crashing, and exploding, The silence was nearly deafening.
The intensity of the battle continued right up to the last 2 or 3 hours, and I would guess that it was something like 2 or 3 o'clock on the 26th that all of a sudden it got silent. And that was the first time, and this was the unbelievable thing I would never have believed, and probably people listening to what I say would say that's a stretch. But for 24 hours a day from the 19th to the 26th, it was just as noisy at night as it was in the daytime. Then the volume of noise was almost ear-splitting at times. It varied, the pitch of it varied, but there was never a time that there wasn't massive combat noise. And when it became silent, everybody became afraid, literally, because you wondered when you looked in every direction, you saw all the cracks and crevices still remaining, and you wondered when some SOB was going to stick something out of there and start it all over again.
It was a valid fear, as the Marines knew that there must be more Japanese on the island. They had killed thousands and thousands, but not all.
And I remember that Stan was telling about a friend of his that he said that while they were there and they were waiting to board the landing craft, that this one fellow happened to stand up and look around like that, and at that point a sniper got him. So it was supposedly it was secure, but it wasn't.
As the Marines' mission on Iwo Jima was coming to a close, the Army Air Force flew in a unit of P-51 Mustangs. Japanese resistance seemed extinguished, and no one told the Air Corps ground crews and pilots to take any special precautions.
They had a substantial tent cap of fly people, crews that were waiting for transportation back to Tinian or waiting for their plane to be refueled and leave. And they had absolutely no security.
I guess after we had the island pretty well secured, and they got some P-51s in there, some fighter planes. And I remember that one night, a whole mess of Japs got together. They crawled out of their caves, and got together, and they came down there and attacked these flyers who had tents set up.
This was a well-timed raid by the Japanese, whether they knew it or not. The Marines were leaving, the Army was taking over. In the interim, nobody was there to protect anything. And so the Marines had to get their equipment out, and the Army had to find their rifles and whatnot.
On the 36th day, we went back aboard ship. And that night, the Japs had consolidated down by Mount Suribachi, and there were hundreds of them. They got together and they banzai charged down over the Army tent camp.
We got all cleaned up, and God, boy, we were happy we were going to go aboard ship. It was 6:30 the next morning. They rolled us out and said the Japs had got away. They broke through, and we had to go back up. And they raised hell. They went up there, those bastards, and they threw hand grenades in the airplanes, the P-51s that were up there, and they threw grenades in the pilots' tents, and, just raised hell in general.
Our tent was located in the first area that they hit, and they started by just throwing grenades, and then they'd go down, slit the tent with their swords, and pitch a grenade in. There were 5 of us in the particular tent where I was located. The 3 of them left the tent, and 2 were killed, and 1 came back wounded, and all of us in the tent were wounded. And we stopped 4 or 5 grenades that morning. We could see them land right at our feet. All I could do was just duck and close your eyes and feel the concussion. This battle went on from about 4 in the morning till about 9:30. We could hear the P-51s flying over us, and I was hoping, I wish I had been with them up there, not on the ground.
They cut guys right in two in their in their sacks, cots. It was just pitiful. They just slaughtered the air crews that were there, and they didn't get cleaned up till they ran into a Marine group that was at the beach waiting to go aboard ship the next day, and they disposed of the rest of them.
We went back up there, and when we were done, there wasn't any left. We took them right down to the goddamn water.
After that final Japanese raid, the island was more or less secure. With Iwo Jima in hand, the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan was kicked into high gear. Losses fell as Japanese fighters became a negligible threat, and many crippled planes that would have been lost were able to limp back to Iwo Jima. In fact, thousands of damaged bombers took advantage of the lengthened airstrip on Iwo, leading some to say that the number of killed and wounded Marines was equal to the number of B-29 aircrew that were saved by being able to land at Iwo Jima.
A lot of Marines died for Iwo Jima, but I can tell you that I was on Iwo Jima after a mission on more than one occasion. I think I landed there 6 times, but I can recall seeing upwards of 300 B-29s on Iwo Jima at one time. And you can imagine how many airplanes possibly wouldn't make it back another 750 miles with the extreme damage that was, a lot of them were taken, or shortage of fuel. And the terrible losses that the Marines took for Iwo Jima, I think, saved the war. I really think without Iwo Jima, we would have possibly been fighting for another year as far as I can see.
We had to stop there 4 times. The first time we stopped there, we were just low on fuel. Thank God they were there. So we stopped there, and they were still fighting on the other end of the strip when we got there the first time, and they fueled us up, and we went on back to Tinian.
One of the B-29s that was going back to Tinian lost a motor or 2, and he landed right there on Iwo Jima before the island was secured, where the engineers were still building the road, the airport. And that was the first B-29 I ever saw. That was the biggest thing that I couldn't figure out how something like that big could fly, you know.
Mm-hmm. We got shot up, engines shot up rather badly over Tokyo, daytime mission, and the pilot told us that there's a good chance that we were not going to get back and might have to go into the ocean. So we kind of said, hey, let's go for Iwo Jima. And so old Brewster brought that plane of ours into a fighter strip, which is maybe 1/4 the length you need for a B-29. It's a big plane, 4-engine. And he brought that plane into that fighter strip, engines going out, not working, literally hitting the brakes when we hit the ground. And we were already skidding, and we went in sideways, short of going off the end of the runway, which went right into the ocean. And it was his incredible flying skill that saved all of our lives. I mean, that's it. And somebody saves your life like that a number of times over and over again. You don't forget it. And he got it, brought it to a stop. We all jumped out of the plane in a hurry. The tail gunner jumped right into the middle of the body of a dead Japanese soldier that was lying there. And all I remember is jumping out of there and running for cover, because they were still shooting things up around Iwo Jima at that point. And we were there for several days, and got the plane somehow fixed up and flew that plane back on to Saipan.
And I don't think anybody except the air crews, basically 29s, in the Pacific had a greater debt to pay anybody than the Marine Corps.
When we went to a Iwo Jima reunion down at Camp Pendleton one time, and in a table right in front of where we were sitting, there was a group of guys there, and they had a model of a B-29 sitting on the table. So when it was over, I went down there and I says, "What's with this?" And he says, "Well, I'm Major so-and-so, and I flew one of these things, and I had to ditch." And he says, "I'm here to tell you that if you guys hadn't got Iwo Jima, I wouldn't be here." You know, it saved a lot of airmen.
And he belly flopped on that landing strip and came skidding across that sucker. And when he came to a screaming halt, there was 30 feet of that thing hanging right over our heads. And we watched those guys come tumbling out of that thing and come sliding down that hill. And came over to us, shook our hands and says, "Thanks, fellas." And we knew, then we knew why we were there.
With scores of crippled B-29s forced to land at Iwo, and with P-51 fighters now within range of Japan, the reason to take Iwo Jima seemed logical. But what the battle did to the U.S. Marines who fought it and survived is too often overlooked. It is painful, but fairly simple to count the dead and wounded. What is harder to measure is the hidden costs.
We lost so many people. I often questioned whether it really was worth it. They claimed that it was, that a lot of bombers on the way back from Japan could land there and wouldn't have made it to Saipan. You know, there's several thousand people there that were lost. I don't know if they would say that many aviators or not. Huh?
I think one statistic is that there are 10,000 aviators whose lives are saved by being able to land on Iwo, and that's far more than the number of Marines who die taking that. Now, do you want to weigh one man's life against another man's life? Is that a reasonable proposition? Maybe not, but at least in terms of the strategic perspective, that makes a lot of sense.
There were people dying every day in great numbers on both sides, and finally we were able to crowd them all into caves on the far end of the island and do them in. There were Japanese popping up for a long time after that. It was supposed to be necessary because there were many of the B-29s that when they would bomb Tokyo would be damaged or would have to land for one reason or another, and there was no place to land until they got back to Tinian or Saipan. So as soon as they took it anyway, they put the airstrips on there. So and then it saved, I don't know, hundreds of B-29s that could land there, and the crews. And I guess it was worthwhile, but we sure lost an awful lot of men in the doing.
It effectively lost 2 regiments, 2/3 of the main operating force of a division at Iwo Jima less than a year before Japan would have been invaded. So it's easy to say in one sense that the lives were squandered, they could have been used better. And the Air Force guys would take their own chances. We could have put more guard submarines, ships, on the paths, known places for them to at least attempt to land in the water. It's hard to say. The consequences ultimately didn't really mean anything because the war ended before the consequences could bear fruit. I mean, even the victory could bear fruit.
Was it worthwhile? I suppose the war was worthwhile. Smash fascism, Japanese militarism, and they say that so many B-29 crews were saved by taking Iwo. And the Japanese, of course, couldn't radar ahead to Tokyo that a raid was coming or send up any fighter planes. But there were what, 6,000 dead, something like that? I don't know. Yeah, I guess it was worth it in a way.
But overall, it was a pretty terrifying experience, not only for me, but for all the other young boys that come out of the cornfields and the mountains and had never been away from home before. But you know, if I had to defend my nation and protect my loved ones, I'd do it again. Even though I know the horrors of war. There's a lot of guys, you know, just constant day in and day out, bombing, you know, the mortar shells and snipers, and finally they just, you know, they themselves didn't, I don't want to use the word quit, but just gave up. You can't use that word, but they just, how much can a human being take?
My best buddy O'Banion, he had a shrapnel wound in his left shoulder for a week or so, and he couldn't hardly move his left arm, and then he took a bullet hit through the right bicep, and then he came back over and helped pick up the stretcher and carry Loomis out. And then he and I met again in Hawaii afterwards, spent the rest of our time together. But it's interesting. He came home and became a Baptist minister, and then took his own life.
You hear a lot about what they call combat fatigue and what they now call post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's a word that had not been invented in those days, but I guess I'm quite familiar with it because I feel that I had it, and an awful lot of people I know had it, you know, that went through that sort of thing where you just feel upset, you know, have periods of anger and self-pity and being emotionally upset for really quite a while afterward. Eventually it gets better.
So I'm into this tunnel one day, and much to my surprise, I hear this jabbering. I'm crawling in there, and here maybe 15 goose. And I kill them all. Huh? No problem. Just waste them. Feel nothing about it at all. Next day, same damn thing happened. Another tunnel. But in this tunnel, it's always stuck with me, and nightmares. I killed them all. I thought I did. I was leaving. One of them got up. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But he, in Japanese, was pleading for his life. I just killed him. And I've had...
I hope they never have to do that again. When you think in those 36 days that they were killing and wounding our troops at more than 1,000 a day, that's pretty horrendous loss.
It was over 2.5 weeks before we could even begin to bury our dead. We just didn't have the time. And you fought day and night. You'd go to another guy's foxhole and try to wake him up, and he just looked at you through eyes that cannot see. Up on Hill 362, the meat grinder, we lost over 200 Marines to try to take that in about 3 hours. The carnage, the death was you'd have to be there to see it. I have never in my life have seen so many dead Marines and dead Japanese and you look at those, and you look at your own, and you just think, my God, what have we done? Why is this possible? Why do we have to do it? It's not because we wanted. We were ordered to do it. Finally, when we left the island, there were just 6 from my outfit, and we were on the fantail as just glad to get the hell out of there. We secured the island, we turned it over to the Army for occupation. And I remember Green and a couple of the other guys were on the fantail. We were looking at the island, and none of us said much. But as we were slowly leaving the island Green looked at me and he says, Sarge, was it worth it? I said, I don't know.